So we have taken a look at how this bot is going to work inside of our Xamarin Forms application if we use a web view. And this web view is going to look rather okay. It's going to work very well, and it's going to use even some native functionality such as accessing the corresponding photos on both Android and iOS. However, we don't really have much of a say of how this is going to look. And in many scenarios, we may want a say. We may want to configure how this is going to look to match our brand, to match our application. And so during the next few lectures, we're going to learn how to do that. For this, we're going to be making all of the REST requests required for us to have pretty much the exact same experience that we have seen by using the web view. And it's going to help us just really make the REST requests whenever we need that. So I'm going to start first of all by creating a brand new folder inside of my bot project. That is going to be view model. And inside of the view model, I am going to have yet another folder that is going to be helpers. Inside of the helpers folder is that I am going to have another class that is going to be my bot service helper. And that is precisely going to contain all of the code that is going to be communicating over to the bot. Of course, I will need a specific view model for my main page, but I do want to have this helper just to contain the specific bot functionality. For example, the first thing that we're going to need is to create a conversation. And of course, it's in this conversation where eventually we're going to be sending the text and getting a response back, but that's the first thing that we have to have a conversation. So inside of this class, we're going to be creating a brand new method that is going to be, let's actually make this private, and I will explain why in just a second. Let me just make this private. This is going to be void, and it's going to be called create conversation. And the create conversation method, really all it has to do is go over to the service and get back a conversation ID. So eventually we have a bit of information about what this conversation is. So eventually we can make requests or send new things to this conversation, but all we're really going to need are a couple of values. So let me go ahead and show you what is going to happen in here. The first thing that we're going to need is the endpoint that we have to use to create this conversation. So I'm going to create a string endpoint variable in here. That has to be the base URL, which is https://directline.botframework.com. And there is a version 3 of this bot framework direct line that we're going to be using. And the direct line has a conversations endpoint. If we post to this conversations endpoint, we're going to be creating a new conversation. And actually, now that I think about it, I am going to have only the endpoint itself, because the base URI, I'm going to set it as the base URL. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to use an HTTP client. Of course, I need a using directive. And I'm going to set the base address. And the base address is going to be that part. And this has to be a URI. So let me set this to new URI, which is going to require the string. So the base URI is this one, and this is the endpoint. We're also going to need the authentication, or to authenticate ourselves, set an authorization token, and that is going to be the exact same one that we set over in the view. So if we go over to our web view, which eventually we're going to change, we already have the secret. So we can just copy the secret, because we're going to be using it, to create a new header. So first of all, let me go ahead and to the default request headers, add a new header, and the name is going to be authorization. And the value is going to be bearer, space, and that secret that we have. So this is what we need as the authorization. Finally, all we have to do is from the client, post to the endpoint. And we don't really need anything for HTTP content. Now the post async, of course, is an asynchronous method, so we will have to await this. And if we await it, we're going to get the response. And the response is going to have a content which we can read as a string. And again, this is going to be asynchronous. So the JSON, this is going to return a JSON, is going to be received after we await the read as a string async method. Now, there are a few things that we're going to have in here. And I'm actually going to be representing them with a class. So I'm creating here a private class conversation that is going to contain 5 strings. Actually 4 strings and an integer. So these are going to be the conversation ID, the token, the stream URL, the reference grammar ID, and the expires in. Expires in is the one that is an integer. And so all we really have to do is get a conversation that is going to be, let's go ahead and use JSON convert. And of course, to be able to use JSON convert, we're going to need to add a reference, or actually reference the package newtonsoft.json. So let's add that package. And now we have access to JSON converts, and we're going to be deserializing this as conversation. And immediately we should be getting that conversation. So let me go ahead and set a breakpoint and set up how we're going to be calling this create conversation method. This is actually going to be called directly from the constructor of the bot service helper. So as soon as we create a bot service helper, we want to initialize a conversation, to create a conversation, which eventually will contain all of this information that we should use. And actually, let me go ahead and create a property of type conversation in here, which means that these would have to be public, and that I'm going to be setting the value to that property, not creating a variable. So have something like this. And now what I will need is an actual view model. So I will create a new file directly inside of the view model folder that is going to be the main VM, which is the view model for our main page. And as we create the main VM, let me go ahead and create a variable in here that is going to be of type bot service helper. And I'm going to be initializing the bot helper, which means that I'm going to be creating the conversation, which means that this should be called as soon as we create a main VM. So over in main page, I am going to be creating a main VM instance. So we'll go ahead and get the VM reference in here to the main VM's namespace, get the resource dictionary inside of the resources for the content page, and get an instance of main VM. And so as soon as I run this now, let me just get the key in here. As soon as I run this, I'm going to get an instance of main VM. As I get the instance of main VM, I will have an instance of bot service helper, which is going to create a new conversation right away. And we will see if we are correctly getting that conversation object. So as soon as I run this, we're going to be able to see this breakpoint being hit, and we see all of this information from the conversation ID, the expires in, the grammar ID, the stream URL, and the token. Which means that we have successfully created this conversation, which was the first step required. And we also already have all of this set up with a main VM, which is being created or instanced directly from the main page. Now in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at exactly what is it that we're going to be sending now that we have the conversation created. So we can start to create also the design of this application, the view that is going to be displayed to the user, because now we're not really going to be displaying a web view. So in the next lecture, we're going to continue to work with this helper. So we create the other methods that are required for us to interact with this bot service.